The morning Clara Sutton left Lethbridge, she had 31 cents in her coat pocket, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and nowhere particular to go. She had sold the last of her mother's silver, a sugar bowl and 2 mismatched spoons, to a pawnbroker on Henderson Street who had looked at them the way a man looks at something he knows he is about to underpay for. She did not argue. She took the coins, folded them into her handkerchief, and walked out into the October cold without looking back. Her mother had died in September. Pneumonia. It had come fast and gone fast, the way bad things sometimes do, and it left Clara with a rented room she could no longer afford, a debt to the boarding house of $4.50, and a silence in the mornings that she had not yet learned how to fill. She was 24 years old. She had been a seamstress's assistant, then a laundress, then briefly a counter girl at Hendrick's Dry Goods, before Mr. Hendrick's son returned from the East and needed the position. She could read, write, and do figures in her head faster than most men she had met. None of this had been enough. She walked to the edge of Lethbridge and then kept walking. The road south out of town ran alongside a creek bed that had gone mostly dry. The cottonwoods along its bank had turned yellow, and the wind off the prairie stripped the leaves in long, spiraling curtains. It was the kind of October morning that reminded a person, quietly and without apology, that winter was not a rumor. Clara walked for 2 hours before she heard the wagon behind her. It was a flatbed, loaded with fence posts and coils of wire, pulled by a pair of gray horses that looked like they had seen most of what there was to see and found it unremarkable. The man holding the reins did not slow down as he drew alongside her. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at the horizon, measuring, unhurried, and then returned his eyes to the road. She kept walking. The wagon slowed anyway, not stopped, just slowed. "Where are you headed, miss?" His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not rise at the end of a question as though it expected to be answered. "South," Clara said, because it was true, and because she did not have a better answer. "South covers a lot of ground out here." "I'm aware of that, sir." He was quiet for a moment. The horses blew through their noses, and their breath hung white in the cold air. "There's a homestead about 8 miles on," he said. "The Calloway place. Mrs. Calloway sometimes takes on hired help for the winter, kitchen work, mostly." Clara looked at him for the first time. He was perhaps 40, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. His face was dark from the sun in a way that suggested many seasons outdoors, and his hat was the color of old saddle leather. He was looking at the road. "I'm not a vagrant," she said, and heard the sharpness in her own voice. "Didn't say you were." He kept his eyes on the horses. "I said Mrs. Calloway takes on help. That's all I said." Clara looked at the road ahead. 8 miles. She had 31 cents and a broken carpet bag, and the temperature had not climbed since dawn. "Who are you?" she asked. "Reuben Calloway," he said. "It's my homestead." He did not look at her when he said it. She did not ask him to stop the wagon, and he did not offer. She walked the rest of the way herself. The Calloway ranch sat in a wide, shallow valley where a creek that actually ran, unlike the one near town, cut through the pasture and bent west toward a stand of spruce trees. The house was not large, but it was sound, squared timbers, a good chimney, a front porch that leaned slightly to the left, but showed no signs of surrender. There was a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter with a kind of deliberateness that told Clara someone here took the cold seriously. Reuben Calloway pulled the wagon around to the barn without stopping at the house. Clara stood in the yard. There was no one else visible. A dog came around the corner of the barn, looked at her, decided she was not interesting, and went back the way it had come. She walked up to the front porch and knocked. No one answered. She knocked again, and then tried the door, which opened. Inside was a kitchen that was clean and cold, a fire banked low in the stove, and a smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and something baked earlier in the week that had not entirely faded. There was a coat rack near the door, with 2 coats on it. A pair of work boots, enormous, stood beside the door. On the table was a plate with the remains of a breakfast, a heel of bread, a scraping of butter, a coffee cup, rinsed but not washed. Clara set her carpetbag down on the floor and stood in the middle of the kitchen and thought about what she was going to do. She built up the fire first, because the cold in that kitchen was the kind that settles into wood and plaster and does not move on its own. She found the wood box beside the stove and filled it, and found the kindling basket nearly empty, and went outside and split kindling for 20 minutes until her arms ached and her breath came in short white bursts. And she felt, for the first time since September, like something other than a woman waiting for the next blow. When she came back in, Reuben Calloway was standing in the kitchen. He looked at the stove, which was going now, and at the kindling basket, which was full, and at Clara, who had wood chips on her coat. He said nothing. "I didn't know if the position was still open," Clara said, "but the fire needed tending, so I tended it. If you'd prefer I go, I'll go." He looked at her for a long moment. He had gray eyes, she noticed, the kind that caught light without appearing to give anything back. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes, for more than one. I cooked for my mother and took in 2 boarders for 3 years. I can cook for as many as you need." He was quiet for another moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. It made a sound in the eaves that Clara would come to know very well over the following months, a low, sustained note, like a bow drawn slowly across a string. "Wages are $7 a month," he said. "Room in the house, meals included. Sundays off after the noon meal." "That's acceptable," Clara said. He nodded once and picked up his coffee cup and went back out to the barn. She stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the cup he had left. It was still rinsed but not washed. She washed it. The first week was a quiet negotiation conducted entirely without words. Clara learned the kitchen the way she had learned every unfamiliar room in her life. Carefully, thoroughly, without asking questions, she could answer herself. The pantry was well stocked for autumn. Root vegetables, 3 kinds of dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a crock of lard, 2 ropes of onions hanging from the rafter. There were jars of preserves, Saskatoon berries, chokecherry, green tomato relish that someone had put up with care. She wondered if there had been a Mrs. Calloway. She did not ask. Reuben Calloway ate what she made and said nothing about it. On the 4th day, she made a soup from the ham bone at the back of the cold room, and the last of the parsnips, and 2 onions roasted in the pan first, so they went sweet and dark at the edges. She put it on the table, with bread she had baked that morning, and he sat down and ate 2 full bowls and half the loaf, and, when he was done, he refilled his coffee cup and went back outside. She thought that was something. There was a hired man named Dale who came by most mornings to tend the cattle. He was young, 19 or 20, with a wide, uncomplicated face, and the habit of talking to the animals as he worked. Long, involved conversations she could hear through the kitchen window. He was respectful to Clara in a way that was shy, rather than formal. He called her Miss Sutton and took his hat off inside, even when he only came to the door to ask where the extra harness was kept. There was another man, older, who appeared twice that first week without Clara being able to account for how he had arrived. His name was Gus. She gathered that from the few words exchanged between him and Reuben, and he said nothing to her at all, which she found, after her initial wariness, to be a perfectly companionable arrangement. On Sunday afternoon, her first Sunday afternoon off, she sat on the porch with her mending and looked out at the valley. The creek caught the light and threw it back. A pair of ravens worked the field edge, unhurried. The mountains to the west were already wearing their winter white down to the tree line. She thought, I have been in worse places too, I have been in better places too, but I have been in worse. November came in with a week of clear cold that froze the creek to its edges and made the mornings brilliant and hard. Clara learned that the fire needed to be banked a certain way at night, or it would go cold by 4 in the morning, and that Reuben Calloway rose at 5 regardless of the weather, and that he would drink whatever coffee she left on the stove without comment. But that, he noticed, she was certain of it. When she ground the beans finer and let it steep longer, he brought in a rabbit one afternoon and left it on the kitchen step without knocking. She made a stew with dried rosemary and the last of the carrots and served it for supper. He had 2 helpings. She did not know what to make of him. He was not unkind, he was not warm either. In any of the ways she had been taught to recognize warmth, he did not ask her about herself or tell her about himself. He answered her practical questions with practical answers and her other questions. The few she ventured, with a silence that was not hostile, exactly, but was very complete. What she noticed was this: when she was working and he passed through the kitchen, he always stopped being quite so purposeful. Not obviously, not in a way she could point to. But the pace of him changed, just slightly, like a man remembering something. She did not point to it, but she noted it. In the 3rd week of November, he came in from the yard, with blood on his sleeve, and his jaw set in a way that meant pain he wasn't going to mention. She had been at the table doing figures. She had asked, and he had given her the account book, though she had seen something flicker across his face when she did, something between surprise and calculation. "Sit down," she said. He looked at the chair. "Your arm," she said. He sat down. He had caught his forearm on a fencing staple, a long, shallow cut that had bled considerably and not stopped. She cleaned it with the carbolic she had found in the medicine chest and bound it with strips of clean linen, and he sat very still the entire time and looked at the wall. His hand, she noticed, was very large and very rough, and there was a scar along the back of his thumb that was old and pale, and had not, evidently, been tended to with any particular care when it was new. When she was done, he said, "Thank you, Miss Sutton." It was the first time he had said her name. She thought about that, longer than she was prepared to admit. December brought the snow down off the mountains for real. It came in 3 days of steady white silence that left the pasture fence posts wearing tall hats and filled the yard to the second porch step. Dale arrived each morning on snowshoes, and Clara started getting up at 4:30 to have the fire built and the porridge on before either of them appeared. She learned the rhythm of the ranch the way she had once learned the rhythm of her mother's illness, attentively, without sentimentality, making herself useful in whatever way was needed. She kept a tally of the feed stores and what was going out versus what was left, and one morning, in early December, she put the numbers in front of Reuben at the breakfast table. "You're going to be short on hay by mid-February," she said, "if the cold holds." He looked at the numbers. He did not look surprised, exactly, but something shifted in his expression. He picked up the pencil she had left on the paper and moved a number, and then another, and then put the pencil down. "I know," he said. "There's a way to stretch it. If you bring the south herd into the near pasture by January, you lose less to drift, and they eat less when they're warmer." He was quiet. "My uncle kept cattle near Pincher Creek," she said. "I know it's not the same as ranching, but the principle holds." He looked at the paper again. He looked at her once. Then he folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll think on it," he said. She thought, later, that for Reuben Calloway, that was quite a lot. Christmas came and went quietly. Clara made a roast, a joint of pork she had been saving, and a dried apple cake, and they sat at the table, she and Reuben and Dale, who had no family within a day's ride, and ate without ceremony. Gus did not come. Reuben had given her a small tin of good tea, left on the table without comment, and she had given him nothing because she had nothing to give. And she lay awake that night, thinking about that and about other things she did not want to examine too carefully. In January, the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes a person careful. 30 below, 40 below. Mornings when the horse's breath came in great rolling clouds, and the creek disappeared entirely under the ice, and the world reduced itself to a small circle of lamplight and wood heat, and the smell of whatever was on the stove. It was in January that she found the letter. It was not snooping. She had been putting away the account books, and the letter had fallen out. She supposed it had been tucked inside, and it was open, and she saw the letterhead before she could stop herself. Northern Alberta land and mortgage. She read 3 lines and then stopped reading, and then sat down at the table with the letter and read it through. The loan had been called, not foreclosed, not yet, but called, payment demanded in full by the 1st of March, and the figure named was the kind of figure that does not reduce itself by willpower alone. $340. Clara thought about the account book she had been keeping for 6 weeks. She thought about the hay in the barn, and the cattle in the pasture, and the fence posts and wire on that flatbed wagon the first day she had seen Reuben Calloway. She put the letter back in the account book. She spent 3 days thinking. On the 4th day she asked Reuben if she could see the full accounts, not just the monthly tallies, but the underlying figures. What the ranch had brought in at the autumn sale, what the expenses had been, what the loan terms were. He looked at her across the kitchen. There was something in his face she had not seen before, or not clearly. It was not embarrassment. It was the expression of a man who is trying to determine whether he is being offered something or asked to surrender something. "Why?" he said. "Because I can do figures," she said. "And because $340 is not an impossible number if you look at it correctly." A silence. The fire in the stove made its small, steady sound. "You read the letter," he said. "It fell out. I read 3 lines and then read the rest, because it seemed worse to put it down half-read." He was still. She waited. Outside, the wind had come up again, that same long, sustained note in the eaves. "All right," he said finally. She worked for 4 days on the full picture. What the cattle had sold for in October, what he owed against the machinery and the north pasture, what could be liquidated and what could not without destroying the operation entirely. She cross-checked the figures twice and then wrote out a clean column and showed it to him. "If you sell the bay team in the spring when prices are up," she said, pointing, "and if the south herd is consolidated the way we talked about, lower feed costs through February, and if you hold back 12 head from the spring calf sale to bring per head at the fall auction, you can have $340 by late August. That's 5 months past their deadline." By late August. He studied the numbers for a long time. They might not wait. They might not, but they're more likely to wait for a man who comes to them in March with $40 in hand and a written plan for the rest than for a man who doesn't show up at all. He looked up from the paper. "You've dealt with bankers before," he said. It was not quite a question. "I've dealt with landlords and pawnbrokers and one very unpleasant man from a linen company who came to collect a debt my mother couldn't pay," Clara said. "The principle is the same. They want the money, but they also want to believe they made a reasonable decision when they loaned it. Give them a way to believe that." Happened in his face that she was not sure how to name. Not amusement exactly. Something quieter. "All right," he said. Again, she thought, again, that for Reuben Calloway, that was quite a lot. He went to the bank in Lethbridge on a Thursday, in early March, in the wagon, in the good coat she had brushed the morning before without being asked. He came back in the evening with the horses tired, and his face unreadable, which she had come to understand was not the same as closed. He came into the kitchen and sat down, and she put a plate in front of him, and he ate half of it, and then said, without looking up, "They'll extend to September. $40 now, and the balance by the 1st. Clara sat down across from him. "That's what we planned for," she said. "Yes, the fire, the eaves, the dark outside the window, which was total and absolute in the way prairie winter dark is, without city light or anything to soften it. The question," he said slowly, as though the words were something he was figuring out as he went, "the question isn't whether we can make the number. We can make the number. The question is whether any of this." He stopped. He picked up his fork and put it down again. "Whether any of this holds together the way it needs to." Clara looked at him. "The ranch?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he looked up, there was something direct and uncomfortable in his gray eyes, like a man who has decided to stop being careful. "I'm not only talking about the ranch," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle. Outside the window there was only dark and cold, and the long unlit distance of the prairie. "I know," she said. Spring came late that year, as it usually does on the Alberta prairie, arriving not as a single event but as a series of concessions. A day above freezing, then two, then a week of rain that washed the yard to mud and brought the creek up over its banks for 4 days before it settled back. The cattle came through the winter in better condition than the previous year. Dale told her this with some pride, as though it were a shared accomplishment, which she supposed it was. The south herd had been moved in January as planned. The feed stores had stretched. The bay team sold at the spring sale in Fort Macleod for $65, which was better than she had projected, and she revised the figures and showed them to Reuben over supper, and he looked at them for a long moment, and then looked at her and said nothing. But the way he said nothing was different from the way he used to say nothing. She had noticed, over the winter, that he had begun to consult her, not loudly, not with any formal acknowledgement that this was what he was doing. He would bring a question into the kitchen along with the cold air and the smell of the barn, and she would answer it, and he would go back out. Whether to patch the north fence or hold until the ground thawed. Whether to sell at Fort Macleod or wait for the Lethbridge sale. Whether the gray mare was worth the farrier's bill. She answered honestly and without hedging, because hedging is what people do when they are afraid of being wrong, and she had found that she was not afraid of being wrong. She had been wrong before. Being wrong was recoverable. What was not recoverable was failing to say what you actually saw. He had not said more about what he had said that night in March. Neither had she, but there was a change in the weather of the house that she could not have described precisely, only that it had changed. He brought the kindling in without being asked. She started making enough coffee for 2 cups without thinking about it. Small domesticities, unremarkable in themselves, and she knew it. Aggregate they were something, and she knew it, and she believed he knew it. In April, a letter came from a woman in Medicine Hat, who turned out to be Reuben's sister. Clara learned this because the letter sat on the table for 2 days before he opened it, and when he did open it, he was quiet for the rest of that evening, and the next morning he said, without preamble, "My sister asks if I've taken on a housekeeper. What will you tell her?" Clara said. He was at the door, putting his coat on. He looked at her once. "The truth," he said, and went outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then went back to the bread dough she had been working, and folded it over, with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. The summer passed in the way that good summers do, too fast and full of work, and occasionally, in the evenings when the light went golden and horizontal across the pasture, almost unbearably beautiful, she kept the kitchen garden she had planted in May: potatoes, beans, squash, onions, a row of carrots that came in thin but sweet. She put up preserves in August alongside the work of the harvest. A crew of 6 men came from neighboring ranches for the cutting, and she cooked 3 meals a day for 8 people for 2 weeks and did not collapse. Though it was closer than she would have admitted. On the last night of the harvest, the crew ate at the long table. Reuben and Dale had set up in the yard. Clara had made a pot roast and 2 kinds of pie and fresh bread and a pot of beans, and she stood in the kitchen doorway looking out at the table and the men who had spent 2 weeks on the Callaway land and were now clean and sunburned and talking over each other, and Dale was saying something that made the man next to him laugh. And Gus was there. She saw, eating with his hat still on, and the sky behind them was going pink and green above the mountains. She went back into the kitchen to get the coffee pot. When she came out, Reuben was standing at the door, not blocking it. He was not the kind of man to block a door, but standing near it in a way that meant she had to stop. "You did all this," he said. He said it the way he said most things, quiet and factual, but there was something underneath it. "The crew did most of it," she said. "I mean," he stopped. He looked at the table and then at her. "I mean all of it, the winter, the accounts, the letter from the bank." She waited. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "I know," she said, "but I should say." He stopped again. He was looking somewhere past her shoulder, and then he brought his eyes back to her face with what appeared to be a deliberate effort. "I should say that this ranch is better than it was, and I know why it's better." The coffee pot was warm in her hands. The voices of the men at the table carried in the evening air. "That's not only me," she said. "You made the decisions. You made it possible to make them." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things easily. She understood that more clearly than she had understood almost anything else in the last 10 months. "Reuben," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw that he noticed. "Are you trying to tell me something?" A long pause. "I'm trying," he said, "to figure out how to ask you something." The voices at the table. The last of the light over the mountains. "You could just ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment. And then, without ceremony, without anything that could be called romance, in the conventional sense, he asked her, plain and direct and without embellishment, in the manner of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at a point where thinking is no longer the appropriate activity. She said yes. They were married on a Saturday in October, a year nearly to the day, from the morning she had walked out of Lethbridge with 31 cents and a broken carpet bag. The justice of the peace in Fort Macleod performed the ceremony. Dale stood up with them, still in the habit of taking his hat off at important moments. Gus was there too, hat still on, which she had by now accepted as simply his way. Reuben's sister came from Medicine Hat and shook Clara's hand with the grip of a woman who is reserving judgment, and then looked around the kitchen and the garden and the well-stocked pantry and the neat columns in the account book and revised her judgment over the course of an afternoon without saying so directly, which Clara recognized as a family trait. The ranch that October was prosperous in the way that things become prosperous, slowly, through work and attention and small correct decisions made over time. The fences were sound, the herd was healthy. The hay was stacked high in the barn and would last well past February. On the night of their wedding, after the guests had gone, and Dale had ridden back to his own small place down the creek, and the house was quiet. Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. The moon was up over the mountains. The creek caught it and sent it back in fragments. Reuben came and stood beside her. He did not say anything. He put his hand on the windowsill near hers, not touching, and then after a moment he turned his hand over, and she put hers in it. That was all. But all, she thought, was sometimes exactly enough. She had come here with nothing, and she had made something, not from luck and not from charity, but from the same thing her mother had always told her was the only thing worth carrying: the willingness to show up, to look at what was needed, and to do it. She had done it in a cold kitchen in October. She had done it in the figures on the account book, and the letter to the bank, and the preserved jars lined up in the cellar, and the garden put to bed each autumn with care. Outside the window, the prairie ran on in every direction under the moon, unbroken and indifferent and enormous. But inside the circle of lamplight and wood smoke, in the kitchen of the Callaway Ranch, there was something that had not been there a year ago. Something quiet and durable and earned. She thought that was worth more than she had words for. And she was fairly sure that the man standing beside her, the one who did not say things easily, knew it too.